Welcome to PolkaWorld. And very happy that we get a chance to know your new project. And so first of all, please tell us about yourself and your network.
Yeah, for sure. And thank you for having me. My name is Francisco. I'm the CEO of Moondance Labs, the development company responsible for building the Tanssi network. Before starting to work on Tanssi, I was part of the core team of Moonbeam. I worked there for several years, focusing on ecosystem development and growth. And throughout those years, we kind of realized that we needed kind of an infrastructure protocol that made it easier for developers to deploy application-specific chains. We were always very much attracted by the thesis of Polkadot, right? This idea that there was never going to be one chain that handled everything in the industry, that there were going to be many chains, and that the key questions to address were going to be related to how those chains communicate with each other, the specialization of use cases for each of those chains. So that's kind of why we're always attracted by the design of Polkadot and what it proposed. But I think from the process of building Moonbeam, we realized that building chains isn't easy, right? So we thought that there was something needed in the industry to just make that space more accessible to developers.
Actually, what exactly is APP chain?
It's basically for if a development team wants to deploy their own chain as opposed to deploying smart contracts in an existing shared EVM environment like Ethereum or Moonbeam, they can just build their own chain, right? And I think Appchain is the most common terminology. It refers to an application-specific blockchain, right? To have just one chain dedicated to your specific application. But it can also be a layer one. It can be a hybrid model between smart contracts and your own chain. So I mean, there's a lot of different terminologies nowadays, but in my mind, it's the concept of a development team deploying its own chain, right, as opposed to building on an existing shared EVM environment.
Yeah, and why people choose, a APP chain from the layer ones?
Yeah. So I think we've spoken to a lot of teams about this, and just from having built Moonbeam, we had our own opinion, right? We needed to build Moonbeam as a layer one because we needed to customize things that otherwise, we just needed to do it by necessity. Before starting to work on Tanssi, we spoke to dozens of teams across like Polkadot, Cosmos, some Avalanche subnets teams as to why they were deciding to build their own chains. And after having dozens of conversations, patterns start to emerge. And we boiled it down to kind of three main reasons why developers want to build their own chains. The first one is obviously customizability, right? Like you're able to, by building your own chain, you have a much broader range of customizability as opposed to building in a shared EVM layer one, right? Because if you build on something like Moonbeam, for example, you're kind of subject to the architecture that Moonbeam provides for its developers. I mean, it has its positives and its negatives, but there's teams that just need a higher personalization, and building your own chain kind of gives you that possibility, right? Then a second reason is it's closely tied to the first one, to be honest. Like this customizability ultimately can lead to a much better user experience because you're able to kind of modify things at the base level of the chain that adapts itself to the application you're building. There's a lot of examples here, like one chain on Polkadot called Frequency. I mean, they're building a social network where they want to make it as easy as possible to onboard users. So they made like gasless transactions to make it easier for users to enter the chain or the ecosystem. Osmosis on Cosmos is also a great example. I mean, they've made a bunch of modifications at the base layer of the chain to make it more UX friendly. You can pay for gas in any token that's supported by the DEX. There's native liquid staking. They have built-in like wallet and bridge functionality. I mean, all of these things that make it easier to use just ultimately make the protocol more competitive, right? Versus other protocols. And then there's this idea of like sovereignty, right? And decentralization, where a good use case there or example is DYDX, right? They went from Ethereum to Starkware, and ultimately they just didn't feel comfortable with the centralization of L2, so they decided to build their own chain on Cosmos since they had more control over these parameters, right? A lot of teams are attracted by this sovereignty. You have your own governance mechanism, you have dedicated block space, you're independent, and there's also this point on the value accrual towards the token, right? Which maybe isn't talked about so much, that teams are attracted by having their token be the underlying Appchain token, since you use it for everything, right? You use it to pay for gas, for fees, for staking, you have governance. So this is also something that teams have been attracted by.
But in Polkadot ecosystem, if you need your apps more customized, you can just to be a parachain.
Yeah, and honestly, like parachain, this is what I meant before, right? That like there's a lot of terminology thrown around. In my mind, app chains, parachains, layer ones. While the use case might be different, at the end of the day, you still have to build a chain, right? So in my mind, building chains kind of encompasses all these different terminologies.
In terms of Polkadot, even though we say that Rust is more advanced and Wasm is more advanced, but the story is that people like Solidity. And still in this current situation, that how do app chains compete with layer 2s? Because when we talk about layer 2s, mostly we're talking about layer 2s for Ethereum.
Yeah. That's a good point. I mean, I think Ethereum has just managed to create this entire ecosystem of adoption and kind of tooling around it for the last years that it's become incredibly popular, right? And in fact, like the chains that are going to be deploying through Tanssi, I would say maybe 95% of them are going to be EVM-based chains, because this is just what developers know how to use, and there's just this is what's currently in demand. In terms of the L2s, it is true that they're quite popular. I mean, they have the weight of Ethereum behind them. I see some like key differences. And by the way, there's a lot of like different app chain infrastructure offerings today, right? These like L3s or L2s and app rollup are quite popular. In my mind, there's some clear differences with like substrate-based chains, right? The most significant one is the degree of centralization, right? I think this is one of the biggest problems with L2s and L3s right now, is that they rely on like one sequencer to relay all transactions to get settled on Ethereum mainnet. I mean, it's really, you're depending on one node for everything, right? Whereas with Substrate and Polkadot, the ecosystem is highly decentralized. There's hundreds of validators. So this is something that, I mean, I think decentralization is one of the values that we take seriously and that we consider is essential in Web3. Another one is the degree of customization, right? Like Substrate is highly customizable. It's very modular. I would say that the op stack and these like app rollups aren't there yet in that regard. And then interoperability, right? These are issues that Parity has been working on for a long time, along with the Cosmos ecosystem. So they both have like IBC and Cosmos, XCM and Polkadot. This is something that L2s don't have like readily available. So they depend on getting integrated by other bridges that might have like more trust assumptions built into them. I know there's teams working on like IBC enabled rollups, but that's not there yet, right? So the main differences in my mind versus L3s and L2s, yeah.
And what do you think is the most thing that developers cares most? Because as a infrastructure project, we always will taking consideration of let the developers' life more easier. But in the end, people always choose EVM stuff. Why? So what they really cares about?
That's a good question. I think ease of use, right, and like convenience is probably one of the things that developers care most about, is how easy it is to build, right? And I think this has been a significant problem as it relates to app chain deployments in general. And this is why we decided to build Tanssi. Obviously, it's a combination of things, right? It's ease of use and how easy it is to deploy, but that it's also combined with like how fertile the ecosystem is in terms of driving growth and a user base. The support that underlying infrastructure team is going to give you. And this is something that we've come to learn on Moonbeam, right? It's not only about building a product that's easy to use, but there's so much more that goes into a project being successful, that the underlying infrastructure team has to be supportive, right? As it relates to marketing support, having an excellent developer relations team that's going to be there to support when technical problems arise, having a grants program to help subsidize teams and help them build whatever they want to build. Ecosystem development support, right? Getting them connected to different teams, VC networking, right? Like getting them connected to VCs to help them fundraise. So there's all these different components that go into play. And these are things that we're taking to heart at Tanssi.
In terms of app chains, there are some competitors in the market. So how do your network compete with others?
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, we already talked a little bit about L3s. These are like app rollups on mainnet. And in terms of describing Tanssi itself, Tanssi, we're describing it as an Appchain infrastructure protocol. So just making it a lot easier for developers to deploy their own app chains, right? Because when it comes to building app chains, there's a lot of different friction points that arise for developers. For example, bootstrapping a validator set, then you launch the chain and you need to maintain it. Then you realize that you need a bunch of tooling, right? Like wallets, block explorers, RPC endpoints, indexers, oracles. So in my mind, Tansi's job is to kind of abstract away this infrastructural complexity away from the developers, so that the time to market to deploy app chains is reduced dramatically, and also at a fraction of the cost, right? Because right now it's significantly expensive to deploy app chains. So this is kind of what we're tackling with Tanssi and it has to be in a fully permissionless way, right? This is something that I see that's a difference with other app chain infrastructure offerings, is that a lot of the components are kind of it's permissioned in a way, right? Like you depend on a team to kind of do the implementation on your behalf. Whereas with Tanssi, we want it to be it has to be like fully automated, right? And self-service, so that you don't depend on our team to deploy the app chain if you don't want to, right? Like anybody can come and deploy it. So I would say that's kind of a key differentiator in my mind. And Polkadot itself is very well suited for this type of design, right? Because you're leveraging the shared security model that the relay chain has to offer. Then you're leveraging Tansi's parachain. So Tanssi itself is going to be a parachain, but the only purpose of our parachain is to provide infrastructure services, right? So block production. You don't have to bootstrap your own collator set. Like, let's say that Tanssi has 100 collators. Those collators will rotate in and out. So it's going to be kind of a shared collator set. They're going to produce blocks on behalf of these app chains. And there's also going to be a different type of node for data retrievability, so that state transitions can be handled properly. So that's kind of how it works. And the fact that you're using these shared resources, like shared validation, relay chain, shared block production from Tansi's parachain, that makes it a lot more cost efficient, right? Because it's similar to kind of what AWS did in the Web 2 world, where before you had to kind of run all your infrastructure yourself with like bare metal servers and all these things. Then the cloud came along and it just made infrastructure management a lot more accessible and a lot more cost efficient, since you're kind of using these like shared resources, right? But yeah, back to the main question. I mean, there's a lot of competition in this area right now, and for us, it's a good sign, right? Like whenever there's more competition, it means that there's market demand for it and there's traction, right? There's many. There's Cosmos, there's Avalanche subnets, there's Polygon supernets, there's these like L3s on mainnet. With these L3s, we already spoke about them earlier on. With Polygon supernets, it goes back to this kind of permissionless approach, right, that we were talking about. With Polygon supernets, I see that it's kind of like more of a permission model where you need to apply, you need to sign contracts with the Polygon Labs team. It takes several months to kind of deploy the supernet, because in the background, I'm sure they do all the work on your behalf, but it's kind of like human labor, right? And then, yeah, it's quite expensive to do it because you depend on a team to put everything into place. So this is, we're going for a completely different model. Like it shouldn't be that a person has to get our permission to kind of deploy on Tanssi. Anybody should be able to do it in a fully automated way. With Avalanche subnets, I see that it's just a different architecture to Polkadot, right? Where you're responsible for bootstrapping your own validator set. I think it's quite expensive the more validators you onboard, the more expensive it becomes. So as a consequence, I think a lot of subnets, they don't have a lot of validators, right? Some of them have 5, 7, whereas on Polkadot, you have like, I think over 400, 500, I don't know what the exact number is, but that's like a highly decentralized ecosystem, right? It doesn't take, if you have 5 validators, that's not great for security, right? And then the interoperability properties in my mind are different, right? With XCM, you're inheriting the security of the relay chain, right? Whereas with other models, if you connect 2 subnets together, you're kind of inheriting the security of the weaker subnet in terms of security. So if a subnet has like 4 validators and another subnet has like 40 or 50, and they connect through this like warp messaging, the stronger subnet is kind of inheriting the subnet with a lower validator count, right? So that's not necessarily great for security. Whereas in the Polkadot ecosystem, everyone is just plugging into the relay chain that is offering like a high grade security in terms of the total staked amount, which I think is in the billions. Those things are all different. And that's not like a slight to any of these other ecosystems. I mean, they're doing a great job. I think at the end of the day, it just comes down to trade-offs, right? Like what is important for the team is if throughput is important, like having sub-second finality and all these things, or sub-second block times. Yeah, you might want to go for these like L3s or build your own custom like Cosmos chain, even though it's quite difficult in terms of infrastructure management. But if decentralization, security, interoperability are important for you, I think this is where like Polkadot excels, right? And in my mind, even this conversation now where we talk about like ecosystems, and it's kind of a very maximalist debate, right? Whereas I honestly think that this is not going to be the case in the years to come, right? Where it's not going to be as important like to talk about the names of the chains. I think applications are going to span across many different chains, right? And we're starting to see this on Tanssi, where a developer might choose to deploy an app chain through Tanssi, but that app chain might serve like a very back-end focused role, right? Where it might be that the developer wants to offload certain compute processes to that app chain or certain workloads to the app chain. But that doesn't mean that they can't deploy on these other ecosystems through smart contracts like on Ethereum or Arbitrum or Avalanche or Polygon. We're starting to see these hybrid models where the developer will deploy smart contracts in these ecosystems, but then they might have an app chain to kind of offload certain work processes, or to have like a hub as their own app chain, but still having smart contract deployments, and then connecting those deployments through general message passing protocols like Axelar, Layer 0, Hyperlane, Wormhole, these types of protocols. So I think we're going to start to see these like amalgamations of an application utilizing all these different ecosystems. It's no longer going to be like ecosystem focused apps in my mind. So, and this goes into this like modular narrative, right? Where it's like, okay, you have execution on an L3, you have data availability on something like Celestia. We're starting to see these types of different combinations of applications.
The infrastructure is very important, such as, the Uniswap, is the top app in Ethereum. In Ethereum. So what do you think that when the Appchain works, so what kind of apps or scenarios will be the best use cases?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. So far, we're collaborating with several teams, and we're honestly seeing use cases across the board. Like there's DeFi use cases. So we have a lending and borrowing protocol that's going to be deploying through Tanssi, like a cross-chain one, similar to Prime Protocol, where they're kind of, the concept is that you can borrow on chain A with having collateral on chain B. There's a leverage margin trading platform called Leverify that's going to be going live on Tanssi. We're seeing NFT use cases, right? Remark wants to build their own chain on Tanssi, gaming as well, decentralized identity, SocialFi. So honestly, we're seeing use cases across the board. In terms of what applications will be the ones that are most successful, that's a little bit more difficult for me to say. But I'm also particularly interested in these scenarios that I mentioned before, right? Where it might be like an application that lives on Ethereum, like smart contracts might live on Ethereum, but there might be like some intense like or demanding like compute processing that they need to do that they offload to like an app chain, right? So I think we're going to start to see more and more of that, where like an app chain is used for like more of like a back-end focused workload, where the application might live on like Polygon or Avalanche or Ethereum, but then you have the app chain to kind of offload some of these like back-end focused processes, which I think is super interesting, right? Because you move more into this like, it's kind of like a cloud, right? It's similar to what the cloud represents in Web 2. And I'm also starting to see use cases with gaming, like games that want to deploy on many different ecosystems, because as a game, you want users, right? So this like mono-chain approach for games maybe doesn't make that much sense, because, I mean, I think it's logical that teams want to have access to different ecosystems, different users, different assets. So I'm starting to see use cases where games deploy their contracts on many different chains. And then they use Axelar, for example, if they have like a game engine that is too demanding for like using like a shared EVM environment, they might want to use their own app chain to kind of offload that process to not take up too much block space. So these are the types of use cases that I find quite interesting.
Thanks for sharing, and let's keep in touch. Looking forward the successful launch of Tanssi network. Thank you so much.